The night every child lost their voice. Quiet before. They say the day was ordinary. The sun was not special, it simply did its usual slow arc. Mothers pounded yam in the shade of white porches, wooden pestles thumping steady drums into bowls of steaming tubers. Fathers mended nets by the river, fingerwork passed down like a prayer. Children darted between huts, chasing lizards and daring one another to climb farther up the mango tree. The air smelled of toasted corn, smoke, and the river's wet breath. Kemi braided her hair under the baobab's wide belly and laughed at a private joke. She could have been anywhere at that moment, laughing into the bright day, but the village would always remember what happened next. From the cliff path, an old trader came down toward the square. He did not hurry. He did not call. He carried a small carved box wrapped in red cloth. The cloth had been stitched in a strange pattern no one knew. He looked at the children with eyes that had held too many moons, tired, patient, and somehow hungry. The market drum beat for the harvest that evening. Children ran in circles, breathless and bright. They sang the song of green seeds and slapped their thighs and made rhythm with bent knees. The trader opened the red cloth slowly, like a man opening a gift in a house that couldn't afford joy. Inside lay something small and black that seemed to breathe. It looked like a pebble taken from the night itself. Some small thing moved inside it, a tiny rise and fall that made the children lean near. Little turned, the smallest of them all, edged forward with that brave foolishness only the youngest have. He giggled and reached, just a fingertip, into the boxer's dark. The box trembled. The sound that came from its throat was a thin snap, like a kite string breaking in wind. Silence fell as if someone had dropped a lid over the sky. At first they thought Tond had choked. They called his name and he smiled and mouthed the shapes of words, but nothing escaped his mouth. Kemi's tongue felt heavy, like cotton tucked in the back of her teeth. A wind slipped across the square and no bird sang. By the time the moon climbed up, every child in the square tried to speak and could not. Their faces moved, their lips made the shape of laughter, of anger, of hurt, and no sound left. Only the adults could speak. Grandmother Aya washed a clay pot and froze, listening to the hush. She had heard the old stories of silence traded in the forest, but those were tales you told by the light of a smoky fire. This was different, this was happening in her courtyard. She stepped forward, voice small and hoarse from years of telling truths. "Who brought that?" she croaked. Her voice, thin as it was, seemed too large for the quiet. The trader only looked at her, unbowed. He placed the box before her like money on a table. The black thing blinked, like an insect caught in a matchbox. The lantern's flames trembled and guttered as if afraid to look. Aya's hand shook. She pulled the cloth back the smallest bit and whispered, "This is not for children." The village listened with their mouths closed. The night leaned closer, and in the trees something small and alert watched from where the dark was thick as wool. The market without voices. Dawn came thin, pale as one cloth. The market filled with adults calling for fish and peppers and sacks of pounded yam flour, voices filling the lanes in the old, loud way. But the children sat in groups, their hands pressed over their mouths like small, worried lids. A baby named Ada blinked and called her thumb where she would normally hum. Her confusion was a small, bright thing the adults couldn't quite name. Aya put the black pebble on a low stool and held it to the light. It was cold and smooth and thrummed a faint, hungry beat against her palm. Chief Okoro came to see, his face a map of worry lines. He called the council elders and they argued in tight, low tones, trading theories like coins. They spoke of curses, of spirits angry with the town. They spoke of offerings and priestly rites, but all their words slid past the children like leaves on a stream. The children watched mouths move and tried to learn meaning from the shapes. Without words, the children tried everything that could make sound. They stomped on dry calabashes and clapped in boards. Some tried whistles, others began to teach themselves to hum with their mouths closed. Kemi discovered she could press her lips together and make a small hum that seemed to ripple through the chest and calm others. Tond, unable to speak, made a tiny drum from palm leaves whose thud became a heartbeat the group could follow. Midday, the trader returned without fanfare. He placed beside the black pebble a coin with an eye carved into its face. It was warm in the sun, humming softly, and when he gestured toward the forest, his eyes gleamed like coins in a stream. He left without a word. Aya studied the objects by lamplight. Bargains, she said softly, the word like grain through a sieve. She remembered the old lullabies that told of a river of voices, Naamiri, from which people once borrowed words and returned them as offerings. Perhaps, she thought, someone had unsettled the balance. That night the children huddled in Aya's kitchen, tapping messages on the mortar with stones and teaching each other a language of 2 quick taps for a danger, 1 for food, and 3 for stay. They drew on the red cloth with charcoal and wrote rules: stay together, do not touch strange things, trust Aya. Outside, by the fence, a small set of eyes blinked like distant embers. Someone, something, had left a small, wet shoe near the path. It smelled of sea and old sorrow. The rules of silence. When the council tried to make rules, the children made their own laws with dark charcoal on red cloth. They circled the rules and tried them out, tapping and blinking them into each other's palms. The elders spoke of priests and offerings and the wrongness of dealing with forest. They paced and worried. They could not imagine life without the small scold a parent uses to call a child home. The silence held its own rules, harder to see until you had to live inside them. During the day the children practiced. They staged games that needed no words, shadow pictures on mud walls, slow dancing where breath measured time, and hiding games that relied on the soft shuffle of feet. They learned to whisper into cupped hands so the breath itself could be carried as message. The village adapted in the clumsy ways of people learning to live with a new loss. But the silence had teeth. Kemi discovered that the farther a child walked from the baobab and her hut, the thinner their courage grew, like cloth left too long in sunlight. Chike nearly slipped on the riverbank while hauling a bucket. He kicked and splashed, but when he tried to call, his mouth shaped the noise and nothing came out. Kemi sprang forward, gripping his arm and dragging him to the root. When the men of the village pulled him up, they told themselves they had heard a noise and had rushed, but in truth it had been Kemi's wide eyes and flailing hands that raised the alarm. One evening a girl returned to the square with a black leaf clenched in her hand. For one small second, a sound escaped her, a high, frightened little yelp, as if her voice had found a crack to leak through. The crowd went still, tasting life in that single sound. But when she tried again, the voice dissolved. Aya held the leaf and traced words that belonged to other times. Naamiri, she muttered, remembering a line her grandmother had sung about a river that keeps names like stones. Long ago the town had cut the song tree to make a drum, perhaps the world was calling in its death. On the red cloth someone scraped a message with a nail, return what was taken. The letters were little and sharp as a warning. The first dream. That night the children slept in a cluster on Aya's clay floor, heads side by side like small boats. They dreamed the same dream. It was not a jumble of mango trees and goats, it was a place half river, half forest, where a woman in blue sat on a stone and pointed at the sky. She did not need to speak. The river hummed for her and the water shaped the words into the bones of those who listened. Kemi woke with a strange taste in her mouth, smoke and salt, and a single word lodged in her like a seed, Yumido. She wrote it on the red cloth with a shaky charcoal line and drew an eye beside it. Other children remembered fragments, a red thread knotted twice, the name Nabu, and the feeling of being carried on the breath of a story. Aya listened to the tapping and hummed a lullaby she had almost forgotten. When she sang, even with lips closed, a thin warmth moved behind the children's ribs. For a moment their faces relaxed, as if hearing something old and sweet. The elders argued about whether dreams could be counsels of the gods or only foolish comforts. Chief Okoro decided they must send for Eneni Amoka, a river reader who came from a village 3 days' walk away. Before the elders left, Aya said, if the voice sleeps, be louder with your hearts. Keep your eyes like lamps. Do not let night steal your brave small things. The children tapped a circle on the cloth and promised with their palms. Outside, near the fence, something brushed against the baobab, a single wet shoe left as if someone had stepped out of a dream and forgotten their place. The trader's secret. Eneni Amoka came with beads at her throat and a walking stick carved with small names. She had a quick, steady way of looking at objects as if she could read their hunger. The elders showed her the black pebble and the eye coin. She handled both, lips pursed. She tasted the air with a face like thunder. The trader is neither just man nor beast, she said finally. He deals in lost things. He gathers what slips away when people do not notice. Her voice was low, the kind you lean in to hear. She unfolded a tale of a song tree that once stood at the center of their village. The tree had hummed when the moon was new and kept small voices safe in a hollow. In hard times, the town had cut the tree to build the new drums and houses. Eneni Amoka's eyes darkened when she told it, old debts, paid in silence and a new kind of hunger. The trader, it seemed, walked between words and could take what people kept easy, laughter, a first name, a small story told at fireside. He used children because their sounds were fresh and unspent and easier to carry. That night the trader slipped away into the forest. At Aya's threshold, someone left a satchel with a single note, return them or the silence will swallow even the river. Aya's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside lay a scrap of parchment and a few beads that tasted like stone. The children touched the scrap. It shivered like a living thing, and a small bird that had been sleeping on the eaves took flight and vanished toward the dark wood. They packed. The elders gathered what they could, an old carved flute that hadn't sung in years, a faded cloth stitched with names, a clay pot that bore a small child's fingerprint on the inside. They wrapped these items together and tied them with bright red thread. Eneni Amoka inspected the wrapping and frowned. No money can buy this right, she said. If you bargain with the forest, you must give back something taken wrongly. Bring what was stolen by your own hands. Bring truth. Aya climbed to the stump where the song tree had been and dug. Under the soil, she found a ring of heartwood. It had tiny song carvings in a language no one spoke anymore. She wrapped this carved heart in cloth and cried, for she felt the town's old mistake like a pain in her chest. By dusk a small group, Eneni Amoka, Aya, Kemi, Chike and 2 other children, walked into the forest carrying the offering. Night moved in pockets between the trunks. Roots lifted like sleeping snakes and whispered as if counting. They reached a ring of stone blanketed in moss and a pool dark as overturned night. Eneni Amoka placed the heartwood on the root crown and spoke in soft tones that were more like prayer than words. The pool shivered. The water rose and a carved box surfaced, small, like the one the trader had carried. It had no lock but a hollow the size of a finger. It breathed. But before they could take it, the trader stepped out from the shadows and smiled without teeth. His slow clap made no sound. The children held their breath and felt the forest listen. The wrong scale. The trader's hand closed over the box like a thief taking a coin. He weighed the offering they had brought, then lifted the box and turned it over in his palm. He was patient and his patience was a kind of hunger. In a blink he had traded the box for their offering, and like a shadow folding on itself, he had gone. Eneni Amoka's hands trembled. He measures with hunger where we measure with holding. He uses the wrong scales, she said. He sees what we want and takes the easiest path. The children felt that weighing in the bones. They had come to give memory and been returned a small emptiness. Eneni Amoka led them to the river at first light. The water lay flat as glass, stones beneath like teeth. She poured a cup of water and set it at the bank as offering. From the river rose a shape that was all steam and skin and old eyes, older than the women who had borne the town's names. She touched each child's chest and they felt a small tug in the place where voice should live. The river woman drew shapes in the air with fingers wet as fish, and her fingers spelled out an old answer. Their voices were kept in the market of lost names. To retrieve them they must bargain in that market, but not with coins. The market would ask for something that made them safe: courage, truth, a mother's remembered hand. Chike's mouth shaped the question and only the river's motion answered, they take what keeps you standing. It was not a promise but a warning. The river sank back to sleep. The children left the bank with small wet marks on their clothing and a cold under the ribs. They had a map in pieces and a new fear. The night market. The market did not exist by daylight. It rose like a face in mist at midnight, when the moon hid behind gauze clouds. Stalls of woven shadow stood where fishmongers and cloth sellers usually walked. Lanterns glowed with a light that seemed to breathe. It was not flame but something like kept size. The air tasted of clove and old promises. The trader sat at the center, the box beside him. Around him were other figures that belonged to neither village nor field. A woman with fingers braided of rope sewed memories of first harvest. A man with birds in his hat offered applause in jars. A child of paper with writing that shifted when you looked away held up a label, first words. Eneni Amoka warned them before they entered. Trade with care. These stores will ask for more than goods. They want the thing that keeps you anchored, your names, your secrets, what makes you you. The market's bargains were strange. You could buy a laugh in a bottle, but what you paid might be a small secret. There was a jar labeled Kemi's first song. Kemi's throat tightened when she saw her laugh trapped like a pale ribbon. She wanted it desperately. For a breath she imagined the sound of her laugh skimming the air like a bird. The trader stood and offered the carved box for the town to choose from. He spread lids and jars, each holding a snatch of life, names, giggles, a small portion of a father's last advice. The children moved like moths. Curiosity is not bad, it is simply human. Kemi touched the jar that held her first song. Her fingers trembled. Eneni Amoka's hand flashed and stopped her, but it was almost too late. Kemi had already moved to give something in payment, a secret she had never spoken to anyone, the truth about who her father really was. She felt the weight of it like a stone she had carried for years. Facing a fate where laughter never returned, she traded. The market took the secret and swallowed it. A wind roared through the stores and the taste of iron touched the mouths in the square. Someone's memory vanished that night, small and quiet, but true, and the market grinned without making a sound. The cost. When Kemi's secret left her, an ache settled in the village like rain before a storm. Kemi's mother sat by the hearth and searched her mind for the face of Kemi's father. The memory was there in scattered pieces, smiles, hands, but the name that locked it together had been chewed away. Families woke with gaps where certain words used to sit. The town's speech now had pauses like missing threads in a basket. Kemi felt hollow in a way that had nothing to do with silence. The secret she gave had been a right to keep a small wound private. Without it, the wound had opened to the light and throbbed. She touched the space behind her teeth where laughter used to live and felt it was lighter, as if something had taken a little of her center. Eneni Amoka did not speak harshly. She held Kemi's hand like a prayer. Secrets are currency, she said. You gave something that belonged to the bones of your family. The market did not only take what it could sell, it took what it knew would break people open. In panic, the town began to offer anything the market wanted. They dug up old tokens, a child's first clay bead, an old promise carved on a stick, a wife's braid tucked away. They took them to the market at night and hoped the jars would return what was lost. The market took some and returned parts, cheap echoes of what they wanted. The jars of laughter were thinner. Names came back like echoes shouted into empty rooms. At Aya's hut, the children tapped the red cloth and made a new plan. If they could not trick the trader with offerings, they could learn the market's ways. Ada, small and quick, listened at night and watched how stores were arranged. The children began learning to read the market in tiny details, the way a rope's end caught, the particular scent of a jar's lid. In the forest a small light moved. It was thin as a moth and carried a thread. The river at night answered with a ripple that sounded almost like a song. The little thief. Desperation makes cunning hands. Ada had nimble feet and pockets sewn from sack scraps. Where adults saw danger, she saw gaps. She thought, if the market could not be destroyed, maybe a single jar could be stolen and its sound freed. At midnight she slipped through the rows, feeling the ground with her toes as if it were a dark river. The market hummed low, a sleep breath that made the stall sway. Ada kept low and found a jar labeled in tiny script, Chike's first word. It glinted like trapped dawn. She took a small stone, wrapped in a cloth, and struck the jar. The glass cracked and the sound spilled out not as noise but a ribbon of color, gold and blue, that wrapped around Ada and slid from her palms like silk. She tasted speech like sugar on the tongue and for a single heartbeat she laughed in full, loud sound. Then the sound streamed out of the crack and flooded the square. From then, the children heard small mouths shape syllables again. It was not perfect, true voice assumes a body and a name, but the theft had made a crack and light had poured through. Ada ran and hid under a pile of rope until dawn colored the hot roofs. The trader discovered the broken jar at dawn and punished the market with a silent howl that felt like the world shifting. He planted a curse to frighten the town. Any child who stole a voice from the market would lose the name of someone they loved. The elders clutched at names like us. When the town learned of Ada's act, arguments rose. Some called her reckless, others called her a savior. Chike, whose jar had been broken, pressed 2 fingers to Ada's knuckles and tapped once, "Thank you." The children signed back in a language made of small bright things. The missing names. It did not take long for the trader's curse to bite. A mother woke one morning and could not remember her late husband's name. A father misplaced the nickname his mother used when he was small. Without names, stories unravel. People stopped finishing sentences about grandparents and heroes. Rooms felt colder when people could not call one another by the names that held them together. Aya began to count names every night like a grandmother counts threads. She threaded beads and slid each name like a prayer onto a string. The children carved names into smooth river stones and hid them beneath Aya's floor. When someone forgot, the pair of children who had promised to protect that name would press the stone to the person's heart and whisper the story of the name until the person remembered. Eneni Amoka told them there was a place under the river that kept names like shells. It agreed to return names, but the exchange was measured. For each name returned, a small object from the town would vanish to shore. Spoons, little brass buttons, nets, small things that help life go on, began to disappear. The village traded little things for large things, and learned to live with lighter pockets. Bit by bit, names were recovered. But the recovery did not come free. The town paid in everyday goods. A woman brought her husband's name back only to see her favorite sewing needle disappear. People learned to choose which thing could be given up for which name. The trade felt cruel, but the thought of never being able to call someone by name felt crueler. The trader smiled at their choices, his eyes glinting. The market grew more confident. It had taught the town how to bargain with its own absence. They sung under the drum. They had names again, but having a name is not the same as knowing why it matters. History and memory make names strong. Without the song that used to live inside the town's drum, chorus grew longer and forgiveness shorter. Little slights flared like dry grass catching. The drum heart the town had saved in Aya's hand held the faintest hum. Eneni Amoka said the song slept under the wood. To wake it, they must tell true stories, small things of kindness, shame, courage. Each night Aya hosted a telling under the baobab. Elders came to speak of the time someone returned a goat, young mothers told of last year's charity, and the children tapped out beats to carry the tale. The drum responded. At first the beat was a small pulse underbellies, but with each true story it grew stronger, less an instrument and more a voice. The trader tried to steal that heart. He crept in one night shading his face with a cloak and reached into Aya's hut for the wrapped wood. The moment his hand closed, Aya struck the drum. The note that rose was not the full song, but it cut through the market's web like a blade. The trader dropped the drum and stumbled back, thrown by something he could not trade for. For a moment, children throughout the town felt a small spark light behind their ribs, like a word trying to push through. The trader withdrew, furious. He had not accounted for the town's ability to make its own music using truth. The children had found a way to stitch their missing history back with stories and rhythm. The market watched, its plans turning crueler. The test of courage. Anger made the trader change tactics. He brought a velvet bag and labeled it in faint script, courage. Anyone who touched the bag felt a sudden warm rush and imagined a life with no worry. The market began to offer ease for bravery, an easy night in exchange for a small piece of what made you bold. People were tempted. A weaver who had always risen at dawn to weave was offered the bag and shown a life where she could spend the morning sleeping and yet still have good cloth. A father was shown a life where he never had to face a storm. Some took it. Small acts of help grew rarer, fewer hands reached out when goats fell into a ditch. Fear slid down the town like heavy rain. The children watched and held a meeting beneath the baobab. Amarachi volunteered to sit on the ground near the velvet bag and guard it through the night. The trader offered her a dream, a life of ease and endless sweets, if she would release one memory of her mother's hands. Amarachi thought of her mother's palms, calloused, warm, and always willing, and she said no in a language made of set jaw and an unwavering gaze. She pressed her back into the earth and let the market tempt her through the dark. Aya taught them a new idea: courage is not the absence of fear. Courage was a set of small decisions repeated: climb the tall mango just once more when your knees shake, go fetch a goat in the rain, help a neighbor when your own fire needs mending. They practiced, climbing low roofs, crossing narrow paths, reciting names into each other's ears. Each small act returned a part of what the trader wanted to take. One night, Amarachi stood before the bag and tapped together 2 stones, the sign for no trade. The trader offered a jar containing the voice of a queen who bargains easily. Amarachi tipped the jar back into his face. The trader stumbled and cursed in a language no one recognized, and the market's lamps dimmed at the show of stubbornness. The town felt a tight turn. The trader had underestimated the power of many small brave things done 1,000 times. The bargain of names. The trader, pushed by his losses, acted with sudden cruelty. He snatched Mercy, small, quick, the daughter of a spinner who patterned cloth like sunlight, and vanished. He left behind the coin wrapped in thread and a note: return her name, or never speak Mercy's name again. The town panicked. Parents' faces crumpled. Chief Okoro wanted to pay any price. He argued for a terrible trade: sell every drum and keep Mercy. But Eneni Amoka stopped him. She suggested another pain: give a name freely in place of Mercy's. Children rushed to Aya's house where the hidden stone names were kept. They offered them in a circle around the trader's coin in the market. The coin tested each name and spat them out. None fit. At last, Kemi nipped in the dust and traced, with trembling fingers, an old woman's name she had heard in a story, an ordinary name tied to an ordinary kindness. The coin took it. In a puff of dry smoke, Mercy collapsed into the children's arms, coughing and alive. The trader's rules had been hard: names given freely were beyond his taking. Giving names to each other sealed them like shells in a child's pocket. The town realized to keep names, one must also tell the stories that made them matter. They returned home more careful. Mothers carved names into door lintels and stitched child names into bands tied on wrists. The trader sneered, but his coin had slipped away into river weeds that night. That small victory felt like sun after a long rain. The gathering of small things. After Mercy's return, the town created new rituals. When babies were born, they received a stone with the baby's name carved deeply and a story told aloud so the name would have meaning. Families kept little memory boxes buried under the baobab, each box a promise, a story, a small object that anchored a name. Children became guardians of these boxes, their hands learning to hold history. Aya devised a plan to strike at the market's heart. If the trader's power came from measuring values against each other, then they must break his measure. The plan was to steal the trader's mirror, a small thing he kept under his cloak that showed not mere faces, but the hidden truth inside a person. Ada, Kemi, Chaik, and Amarachi were chosen. That night they slipped into the market. Ada's small size let her pass between sacks, Chaik dove under stalls to free small jars. Amarachi's courage kept her steady, Kemi's longing drove her fingers to steady. Under the trader's cloak lay the mirror, no bigger than a hand. When Ada lifted it, each of them saw the part of themselves they had been afraid to keep. Ada saw bravery like a small badge, Kemi heard her laugh, Chaik found his first word echoing like a bell, Amarachi saw the face of the mother she guarded. They ran. The market howled without sound. The trader lunged and grabbed the mirror, but when he looked into it he saw the child he had been once: small, hungry, ashamed. The mirror cracked with the sound of breaking honesty. Without its true scale, the market's counting faltered. Stalls toppled. Jars rattled like teeth. The trader's coin rolled away and sank in the river, and for the first time since the pebble appeared, the market lost its perfect gut for what to take. The return. When the mirror cracked, the jars began to leak. Voices poured through the gaps like fish through a net. It wasn't a clean return, more like stitches being sewn back into torn cloth, but sound returned piece by piece. A baby cried out a first breath, an old man coughed then laughed, the children shouted names and some of the names landed safely in hearts. Aya held the cracked pebble and felt it give way. From it spilled tiny paper birds that fluttered out and shot toward the river in a shimmer of white. The trader, seeing his market collapse, tried to flee into the forest. The elders caught him and demanded answers. He only smiled, bitter and thin, and, in a final baffling moment, muttered words no one else could make sense of and crumbled like dried leaves. The wind took his dust and scattered it across the fields. That night the town sang for the first time in many moons. They were hoarse and raw, but it was honest. Voices found the old songs and new ones came out like small, brave shoots. The drum heart beat steady and true. The river returned a few lost lines of songs as if apologizing for being hungry so long. Children spoke names aloud and then hugged, something harder than words, something that could right wrongs. The trader's market did not reappear. But its ghost passed the forest edge sometimes when the moon was thin, like a memory better not fed. The town kept watch, their story told into the ears of every newborn. The night we learned to keep our voices. Time moved on. The village changed the way it had always changed, softly and insistently. Every child born received their name as stone and story. Mothers wound a small thread around infants' wrists with the name stitched into it. Families kept secret not as weight but as a small shield. Each week, children told one true story aloud beneath the baobab. The drum beat carried these stories away like seeds. Kemi's laugh returned fuller than before. She remembered the secret she had lost and the cost that taught her to keep certain things safe. Ade kept a patch on her hand where the broken jar had caught her, and she showed it to other children as evidence that bravery sometimes leaves marks. Chike dove in the river and climbed out shouting names, practicing the sound until it felt like the warm sun on skin. Amarachi grew into a woman who could not be bought by forces. Eneni Amoka took her beads and walked to other villages to teach river maps. Aya grew older and still sat under the baobab each harvest telling the story to the new ones, simple, repeated, true. Sometimes, on clear nights when the moon shone like a bright coin, a single paper bird drifted down and settled in the branches of the baobab. It looked like an apology tied in paper. Children would clap and laugh and the elders would smile with something like relief tucked behind their eyes. The red cloth, now patched and frayed, hung in Aya's hut. The last line on it read in a careful, adult hand, "Keep your names close, your stories closer, and your silence only for sacred reasons." When a child asks why, the elders do not speak a long lecture. They tap the cloth twice and laugh and point to the baobab. Grandmother Aya, hands knotted with years, would say at every harvest, "We almost lost our voices." She would pause and look at the circle of children, now grown with small ones at their knees, and then she would add, "But that night taught us how to hold them." The children would lean forward, not just with ears, but with all of themselves. And so the night every child lost their voice became the night every child learned, by heart, how to keep it.